This is a really challenging topic for many students. It isn't really the article that trips people up. It's taking the articles and really understanding how they apply to literary criticism. This video might tick some of you off. I'm aware of that and I'm prepared for that. I would like to remind you before we begin that if your ways of thinking aren't being challenged, you probably aren't learning. It's okay to struggle with this. I'm asking you to ask questions. I'm asking you to engage with this. It's a tough conversation because it's an important one. I can't take credit for most of what you're about to hear. It is adapted from an excellent article by DiAngelo and Sensoy titled Leaning In, A Student's Guide to Engaging Constructively with Social Justice Content. I've put the article in the course files if you'd like to check that out instead. This course takes a critical stance, meaning that it assumes that knowledge is socially constructed and that education is always political. It is embedded in a network of social institutions that reproduce inequality. We'll be engaging with topics like socialization, oppression, privilege, and ideology. And the coursework may challenge your worldview by suggesting that you're maybe not as open-minded as you thought. You'll encounter evidence that inequality exists and that it is a deeply structured part of our society. And even more importantly, you'll begin to see that categories of difference, like gender, race, and class, do matter, and they contribute significantly to people's experiences and life opportunities. When I teach this unit about diversity, I inevitably receive journal entries from students who reflect nostalgically about how they were always raised to learn that everyone is equal, and that they are so sad that not everyone feels that way. This is exactly the kind of statement that DiAngelo and Sensoy are going to talk about. Equality is not a reality in America, and no amount of colorblind rhetoric is going to change that. The realities of sexism, racism, classism, and loads of other isms are built right into the foundations of our society, and dislodging them is no small project. When we are confronted with evidence of inequality that challenges our identities, we often respond with resistance. That kind of knowledge is uncomfortable, and we want to find ways of understanding the world that don't force us into discomfort. That is especially true if we are committed to justice and see ourselves as living a life that supports it. Resistance can mean silence, withdrawal, immobilizing guilt, feeling overly hopeless or overly hopeful, rejection, anger, sarcasm, or argumentation. It's normal to react that way because the mainstream narrative in our society is that we are a nation and culture committed to liberty and justice for all, and that all we need to overcome injustice is to be nice and treat everyone the same. All of that sounds very comforting, but it doesn't sync up with what research shows us to be true about how society is structured. Add that to the fact that there are no concrete answers, and students are often unsure about how to handle social justice content. DiAngelo and Sensoy suggest that there are two primary reasons that this could challenge you emotionally and intellectually. First, the standardized testing regime prevalent in American schools encourages us to seek the one right answer. As a result, socio-political topics aren't addressed in ways that encourage students to engage critically. Politically and emotionally charged conversations are avoided because they don't produce predetermined test answers. Second, you're likely to have strong feelings and opinions about socio-political topics, and they may surface through claims like, "People should be judged by what they do, not the color of their skin. I accept people for who they are. I see people as individuals. Focusing on difference only divides us. My parents always taught me that all people are equal. I always treat everyone the same. I've been discriminated against, so I don't have any privilege. Our generation is more open-minded. I have friends from all races, and we're all fine with each other. Race and gender don't matter if you work hard. It's white men who are the minority now." Or, "Women are just as sexist as men." While these opinions are deeply held and appear to be common sense truth rather than opinions, they are predictable, simplistic, and misinformed, given the large body of research examining social relations. Yet, the relentless repetition of these ideas in the mainstream makes them seem true, and allows us to form strongly held opinions without being particularly educated on the issues, especially where we are members of dominant groups, men, white, cisgender, able-bodied, etc. We will almost certainly have superficial understandings because that is the primary message made available to us through mainstream society. Where we are members of marginalized groups, women, people of color, transgender, disabled, we may have deeper understandings of how social inequality works, but may not have the scholarly language to discuss it in an academic context. It is rare that someone is dominant in all key social groups or minoritized in all key social groups, but mainstream society doesn't really prepare us to understand intersecting identities in depth. Let's think about race and class. Consider a white woman living in poverty. She may face class barriers, but not racism. And while she will not face racism, she will face sexism, unlike a poor white man. She is more likely to be held responsible for childcare, is likely to earn less money than a man, and is at more risk for male violence, increasing the burden of poverty. Yet, mainstream culture tends to present poverty as if there is one shared experience of being poor. The concept we're discussing is called intersectionality. People hold multiple identities at the same time that affect their experiences in society. Queer black males have different experiences than queer white women, and so forth. So now that we've covered some of the basics of what we're discussing and why it might be a difficult area of conversation, let's look at some concrete strategies for approaching it constructively and academically. DiAngelo and Sensoy make the following suggestions. 1. Strive for intellectual humility. 2. Recognize the difference between opinions and informed knowledge. 3. Let go of personal anecdotal evidence and look at broader social patterns. 4. Notice your own defensive reactions and attempt to use these reactions as entry points for gaining deeper self-knowledge. And 5. Recognize how your own social positionality, such as your race, class, gender, sexuality, and ability status, informs your perspectives and reactions to your instructor and those whose work you study in the course. We'll look at each of these a little more deeply, but first, let's consider a little example. Imagine you are in a course that fulfills a university science requirement. The professor holds a PhD in astronomy. He has written several books, is widely published in academic journals, and has a national reputation in his field. The course objectives include defining terms used in modern astronomy and exposure to the practices, methodology, and concepts of the discipline. The professor is reviewing the assigned readings, which present the most established theories in the field. He overviews the scientific community's discussion of the number of planets and states that based on the criteria for what constitutes a planet, only 8 planets are officially recognized in our solar system. One of the students raises his hand and insists that there are actually 9 planets because that is what he learned in school. He has seen many books with pictures of the planets, and there are always 9. As further evidence, he recites the mnemonic he learned to pass all of his science tests. My very excellent mother just sent us 9 pizzas. He states that he had a map of the sky in his bedroom as a child, and it showed 9 planets. Further, he says, his parents taught him that there were 9 planets, and many of his friends also agree that there are 9. He spent his childhood camping out and looking up at the sky and identifying constellations, so he has experience in astronomy. The professor tries to explain to the student that to engage with the planet controversy, one must first demonstrate understanding of the criteria for what constitutes a planet, but he is cut off by the student who declares, well, that's your opinion. My opinion is that there are 9. The professor tries once more to explain that what he presents in regard to the number of planets is not his opinion, but knowledge based on the scholarly community's established criteria for what defines a planet. Although at one time astronomers believed that Pluto qualified as a planet, as with all disciplines, their knowledge evolved. And with the discovery of new information and further study, they now understand that Pluto doesn't meet the criteria of a planet, in large part due to its shape. This is not an opinion, the professor repeats, but astronomical theories that have resulted from ongoing research and study. And the student replies, I don't care if Pluto is square, diamond-shaped, or shaped like a banana. It's a planet, and there are 9 planets. How likely is it that the majority of the class thinks our hypothetical astronomy student is raising a credible point? Would the class admire him for standing up to the professor and expressing the same understanding they had but were too hesitant to bring up? Even if his peers did share his view, that would not make his argument valid. It is more likely that he would be seen as having some academic challenges, as somewhat immature and perhaps even disrespectful. It may even be assumed that he might have trouble passing the class. This hypothetical student is a lot like many students approaching social justice topics. He hasn't done the readings or doesn't understand what he has read. He has limited knowledge but is resistant to increasing it. He clings to the worldview with which he entered the course, and he is overly confident about his position. Scholars call this willful ignorance, and it gets in the way of the first guideline, strive for intellectual humility. This often happens because many students see social science as soft science that is value-laden and subjective. In the study of social sciences, and particularly when the topic is social inequality, the behavior of our imaginary astronomy student is not unusual. In fact, it is common for students to argue with professors prior to achieving mastery of the concepts and theories presented. Furthermore, students frequently cite anecdotal evidence to support their arguments and dismiss course content prior to engaging with the research. And unfortunately, students who disagree with social justice content are often taken seriously by classmates, even seen as kind of a hero for speaking up to the professor. Seeing the study of social inequality as a form of subjective scholarship, these students put it on par with their own personal opinions and dismiss it out of hand. That's not an okay way to approach the subject, however. In academia, in order for an argument to be considered legitimate, it has to stand up to scrutiny by others in the field, and must be consistent with the findings of myriad studies in the real world. The key to intellectual humility is knowing that as a newcomer to the field, you have more to learn. We all do, and we can do that by reading carefully, asking questions, and being patient and willing to grapple with ideas. The goal is to move beyond the sharing of opinions and move toward informed engagement. Speaking of opinions, the second guideline is to remember that opinions are not the same as informed knowledge. Our culture places a high value on opinion, sometimes reinforcing the idea that all opinions are equally valid. The truth is, however, that having an opinion doesn't mean that it's based on informed knowledge, and in academia, opinion is the weakest form of intellectual argument. Expressing our opinions instead of engaging intellectually only rehearses what we already think and doesn't require us to really learn. This goes hand in hand with the use of anecdotal evidence. Using isolated personal experiences to support opinions is essentially expressing ideas without scholarly evidence. This brings us to Guideline 3. Let go of anecdotal evidence and instead examine patterns. Anecdotal evidence is superficial, up for interpretation, and not generalizable. Odds are you've heard someone say something like, "My cousin tried to get a job, but they hired an unqualified black guy instead because they had to fill a quota." That represents anecdotal evidence that doesn't consider scholarly evidence about how social inequality works. The truth is that, number one, hiring quotas are illegal. Affirmative action are not hiring requirements, but goal systems for the hiring of qualified people who are underrepresented in a given field. 2, all the evidence suggests that people of color are discriminated against in hiring, not privileged. And 3, the story I just told rests on the embedded racist assumption that the only reason a person of color could have been hired is because of a quota and not because he may have been equally or more qualified. Your cousin doesn't really know. So what's going on there is that unanalyzed personal experiences are not being subjected to rigorous critical thought. Instead of looking for what's right and what's wrong, try to think about how a given experience could be understood differently if you shift your thinking a little. What other lenses could change your interpretation of the event, or what additional information would make a difference? The fourth guideline is to use your reactions as entry points for gaining deeper self-knowledge. You are likely to connect to this content in a very personal way, and there is a chance that you might feel attacked since this may be the first time anyone has asked you to check your privilege. Alternately, you may at other times feel grief or distress as we discuss topics that may hit close to home, especially if you've been affected by prejudice. The authors encourage you to notice where you feel uncomfortable and to use that knowledge to understand the content better. Why am I feeling defensive? What would it mean for me to accept the information as valid? The final guideline is to recognize how your social position informs your reactions to the instructor and those whose work you study in the course. We use the term positionality to describe the unique cross-sections of privileges and disadvantages we each experience, and which affect the way we move and exist in the world. So, for example, I am positioned as a white, middle-class, cisgender woman with ability privilege. I also have straight privilege because I am in a heterosexual marriage, although I do not identify as totally straight. In some ways, my ability privilege is fluid, because though I am able-bodied, I also have an anxiety disorder. These are all personal elements of my identity that affect the way I perceive the world and that affect the way I am positioned in my cultural environment. it is my responsibility to think critically about how that positionality affects the way I function as an instructor and as a student. DiAngelo and Sensoy explain, because instructors of critical social justice content are more likely to name their positionality and encourage students to do the same, they are often seen as more biased. Mainstream courses rarely, if ever, name the positionality of the text they study. For example, the idea that Columbus discovered America is from the colonizer's perspective, but certainly not from the perspective of indigenous peoples. Unfortunately, because acknowledging one's positionality is a rare occurrence in mainstream courses, doing so reinforces students' perceptions of mainstream courses as objective and critical social justice courses as subjective. Yet, all knowledge is taught from a particular perspective. The power of dominant knowledge depends in large part on its presentation as neutral and universal. You're going to be encouraged in this course to constantly ask the question, says who? What perspectives are informing a certain story? If I'm finding it distasteful or judging it as inappropriate, what elements of my positionality may be affecting that? How might someone else perceive it? I'm going to skip over DiAngelo and Sensoy's discussion of grading for right now and move to the heading, Effort is not the same as understanding. They write, when students are worried about their grades or are making a case for the grade they believe they should receive, they often claim that they worked really hard. These students feel that they should be rewarded for that hard work with an A. The reason this argument rarely makes such headway with instructors is because we are grading student demonstration of understanding of content, not the perceived degree of effort expended to achieve it. Consider this analogy. I'm taking swimming lessons. My goal is to compete in an upcoming match. I see myself as putting in a lot of effort by making the time to show up for practice, following my coach's instructions, and swimming the number of laps I am assigned. My coach, however, expects that I will attend lessons and complete my practice sessions. Thus, she is focused on other things, such as how I hold my body while swimming, my breathing pattern, hip and shoulder movements, smoothness of stroke, and speed. And in the end, my coach will determine whether I am ready to compete. This determination will be made based on my demonstrated ability that I am ready, regardless of the degree of effort it takes me to reach that point, and certainly not on the mere fact that I showed up for my lessons and got in the pool. In a similar way, we are grading students on the degree of demonstrated understanding of studied concepts, and not on perceptions of effort, especially because what we as instructors see as effort and what a student sees as effort are not often the same. For some students, doing the readings and handing in assignments are viewed as evidence of a level of effort that should be rewarded with an A. For instructors, this level of effort qualifies as the minimum expectation for all students. Still, we are not grading on how hard a student works, but on the outcome of that work, and looking for evidence that you are learning, and that means engaging deeply with the material and in some way changing the way you think about the content. Deepen your understanding. Change your perspective. Don't be afraid to ask questions and construct a new way of understanding the world. That's what education is about, and that's what we mean by leaning in. By the way, you may find it useful to open the article itself and examine the vocabulary list on the last 2 pages. That's a good place to start expanding your understanding of the topics we'll discuss in this class. If you haven't yet, this is a good time to go ahead and look at the other readings for this week. I look forward to reading your journal entries for the week and to moving forward and learning more together.